My name is Mark Reyes. I'm 36 years old, born and raised in Akron, Ohio. It's not a place people talk about much, and maybe that's fitting. I've spent most of my life being overlooked, too. I don't remember the exact moment my skin changed, only that one day I stopped being the quiet, smart kid and started being the one with the face. Severe cystic acne hit me when I was 15 and never really left. What remained was a terrain of scars, deep, visible, permanent. No amount of dermatology or over-the-counter promises ever smoothed it out. I got used to the glances. I got better at avoiding mirrors, but I never expected that after years of building something real, it would still be the first thing people saw. I'd worked at the same firm for 8 years. Finance, corporate strategy. The kind of job where results matter and image supposedly doesn't. I started as an analyst, the guy who stayed late, never missed a deadline, always brought clean data to the Monday morning review. My numbers spoke louder than I did, and in this field, that should have been enough. I rose through the ranks slowly, not because I wasn't ready, but because I didn't play the politics. I didn't golf, didn't schmooze, didn't do the fake laughing at happy hour. I worked. I delivered. And when the leadership track opened up, I was told, off the record of course, that I was the most qualified candidate. The interview was a formality. That's what my direct manager said. Just show your face, she joked, so they can match the numbers with the man. I wore my only tailored suit, trimmed my hair, tried to shave around the cratered skin without nicking it. It still bled. Always did. My skin is sensitive like that, raw and unpredictable. I looked in the mirror that morning and told myself this was the day it would finally stop mattering. I believed that. I walked into the boardroom at 9:58 a.m. 7 people at a long oak table. The windows behind them made it hard to see their faces right away. But I saw one thing clearly. The pause. The exact kind of pause you feel in your stomach. Not confusion, not surprise, just a sudden tightening in the air like they expected someone else. Someone cleaner, smoother, someone with a more appropriate face for a future VP. The interview lasted 17 minutes. I'd practiced for hours. I knew every possible question about projected growth, client retention, risk balancing, and expansion modeling. But they didn't ask most of them. 2 of the men nodded politely. One of the women took notes without ever looking at me. Another kept his arms crossed and stared at the table. Only the director, an older man in a blue pinstripe suit, spoke more than once. He smiled like you do at someone asking for something they'll never get. They thanked me at the end. No handshake, no eye contact, just a collective sigh of relief when I walked out. And as I closed the door, I already knew the outcome. Not because I had said something wrong, but because I hadn't looked like someone who belonged on their next poster. I didn't look like a face you could trust to lead a team, at least not to them. Back at my desk, I sat down and stared at the open spreadsheet I'd been working on before the interview. Numbers, my comfort zone, no judgment in digits, no bias in formulas. I stared at them until they blurred. Then I opened my email and saw the calendar invite quietly disappear. The one labeled Leadership Candidate Final Round Follow-Up. Canceled. No explanation. Later that day, the promotion announcement came out. They chose Daniel. Same age, decent numbers, not bad at his job, but he had the look. Strong jawline, clear skin, effortless charisma. He looked like someone who got second chances. I'd never had one. Not in high school, not in college, not in the working world. I didn't go home angry. I went home numb. I washed my face, watching the water bead and fall off the uneven patches of scarred skin. It felt like it always did, familiar and exhausting. I sat on the edge of the tub and realized that for all my work, for all my quiet discipline and late nights, I'd never escaped the same invisible line, presentable or not. But something shifted that evening. Not rage, not shame, something colder, sharper. I began to remember things, words, glances, emails, patterns. It wasn't just this one interview. It had been happening quietly, repeatedly, and maybe, just maybe, There was a way to make silence speak. I didn't sleep that night. My apartment was silent, but my thoughts weren't. They moved in tight circles, replaying the interview the moment I stepped into that room, the split-second stares, the empty smiles. Every flicker of discomfort on their faces now burned itself into memory with disturbing clarity. I lay in bed for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the refrigerator in the next room, the occasional creak of pipes behind the walls, and the rhythmic beat of my own pulse in my ears. It wasn't insomnia. It was something closer to surveillance, like I was observing myself from the outside, waiting to see when I'd break. At 4:12 a.m. I got up. No alarm, no reason, just a heaviness in my chest that made lying still unbearable. I walked to the bathroom and turned on the light. The mirror greeted me like it always did, honest, harsh, unwavering. I stared, not quickly, not in passing. I stared until I had no choice but to see everything. My skin was worse under the fluorescent light. That's always been the case. It casts no mercy. The scar tissue caught every shadow. Forehead, cheeks, jaw, years of inflammation and broken tissue woven together in a pattern no one ever chose. Some spots looked almost burned, others like frozen craters. It had texture, depth, character maybe, in a different world. But in this one, it was a warning sign. Something about it said, damage, even if the damage was decades old. I leaned in closer, close enough to fog the glass with my breath. I touched my cheek and felt the familiar ridges. This face, the one I'd carried through every classroom, job, and passing conversation, had become a silent adversary. Not because I hated it, but because I knew what it made people think before I ever opened my mouth. Unease, distrust, pity. All things that don't belong in a boardroom, or so I was told without a single word. And I thought about Daniel. I imagined his reflection, smooth, marketable, camera-ready. I pictured him laughing easily at the same jokes I always ignored, remembered how he'd touch the shoulders of executives like he'd known them his whole life. I could never do that. I'd always kept a slight distance, not because I was cold, but because I knew the rules. People like me don't lean in. We wait to be invited, and the invitation rarely comes. The more I stared at my reflection, the more it stopped looking like me and started looking like evidence. Proof that the world doesn't really reward hard work unless it's wrapped in the right package. I wasn't angry at my skin anymore. I was angry at the lie I'd believed, that substance over style mattered, that results would speak louder than appearances, that anyone could climb as long as they were good enough. That lie had kept me in check for years. It had told me to stay silent when people made subtle comments, to be understanding when others were chosen first, to assume it was always about merit. But now I knew. It had never been just about the numbers. I wasn't being judged only for what I did. I was being judged for how comfortable I made them feel. And I didn't. I never had. I opened the medicine cabinet and stared at the half-empty tubes of acne cream. Years expired, still lined up like failed promises. There were bottles of retinol, fading scar serums, and one razor I rarely used because shaving always ended in blood. Each item was a small surrender. Proof of how long I'd tried to fix something that didn't need fixing, only understanding. I splashed water on my face again. It was cold, brutal. The kind that doesn't wake you up so much as remind you that sleep is a luxury you can't afford. I sat on the edge of the tub, letting the water drip down my chin, then onto the tile. My apartment was so quiet, it felt like the world had stopped moving. But something inside me had started. I picked up my phone, not to text anyone, not to post. I opened my work email and scrolled. I started looking at past correspondence, memos I'd written, reports I'd submitted, responses I'd received. There was a pattern forming, one I hadn't allowed myself to see before. Times I'd been passed over, times when leadership had shifted responsibility sideways instead of up. Meetings I wasn't invited to. Subtle turns, small omissions, each one on its own could be explained away. Together they formed a quiet indictment. I began taking screenshots. Not out of vengeance, but out of clarity. I didn't know exactly what I was building, but I knew why. It wasn't just about being rejected, it was about being made to disappear, without confrontation. They never said the words. That was the genius of it. That was the cruelty. They gave you nothing solid to hold, nothing clear to fight. Only silence, only subtraction. At 6:43 a.m., the sun cut through the blinds, slicing the room into cold gold and gray. I looked back at the mirror one last time. My face hadn't changed, same scars, same structure. But something underneath was different. I no longer saw failure or shame. I saw the exact thing they feared, proof of survival, proof that I didn't bend when it got ugly, that I showed up, even when they hoped I wouldn't. And now I was going to show up in a different way. Not louder, not meaner, just sharper, focused. Because the thing about being dismissed for how you look is that it gives you a rare kind of clarity. You stop trying to blend in. You start choosing where to cut. I'd always believed in the power of preparation. When you don't look the part, you overcompensate in every other area. That was the unspoken contract I had with the world. They could flinch at my face if they wanted, but they'd never find a flaw in my work. I triple-checked numbers most people barely skimmed. I met deadlines before they were even close. My presentations were clean, airtight, impossible to poke holes in. I made it a point to be untouchable on paper, because I knew that once I walked into a room, the paper was all I had. The Monday after the interview, I sat alone in the office kitchen, watching steam rise from a cup of stale coffee. No one said anything to me about the promotion, not even the ones who knew I'd been next in line. People had a way of folding into silence when they didn't want to lie but didn't have the courage to tell the truth either. Daniel walked past me twice. No eye contact, no awkward congratulations. He was smart enough to know it didn't feel earned, but he wasn't about to give it up. I returned to my desk and pulled up my personnel file. I had access to most of it. Performance, reviews, project records, leadership assessments. Over 8 years of clean metrics. Exceeds expectations. Outstanding results. High-value contributor. It read like the resume of someone already in management. In fact, I had trained 2 people who were now in leadership roles. Both of them had leaned on me during their first months. Both had been promoted within 5 years. I was still in the same office, same chair, same view of the loading dock from the 6th floor. I scrolled further. There were comments, short, clinical, harmless on the surface. Strong technical skills, limited executive presence. Valuable support resource. Dependable, though reserved. These phrases are poison in disguise. They don't accuse. They don't condemn. But they tell a story. One where I was always reliable enough to hold the weight. Never visible enough to carry the banner. No one ever said it directly, but I could hear the whisper beneath every word. Not quite leadership material. The deeper I went into my file, the more I realized how carefully they'd constructed the ceiling above me. It was invisible by design. There were no formal warnings, no negative reviews, nothing concrete to object to. But there was also no movement, no risk taken on me, just a steady freeze in place. While others were encouraged, invited, guided, I had been managed, not mentored, held in place, not lifted. I remembered a meeting from 2 years ago. I'd pitched a new model for quarterly forecasting that ended up increasing client retention by almost 9%. The credit had been shared across the team, but the model had been mine, entirely. At the time, I told myself it didn't matter who got the praise as long as the results were solid. That was another lie I'd swallowed to stay silent. Because the truth is, credit does matter, visibility matters, and in an environment where your appearance is already working against you, being invisible isn't just a risk, it's a death sentence. I started compiling a folder, quietly. Nothing dramatic. I copied emails where my work had been acknowledged, but never attributed. I saved slides from presentations I'd created that were reused under someone else's name. I exported performance data that showed my output compared to my peers. Cold, unemotional facts. I knew that outrage wouldn't get me anywhere. People dismiss anger. They listen to patterns. That night, I stayed late, long after the office had emptied out. The building had a certain quiet after hours, something metallic and hollow. I liked it better that way. No eyes on me, no noise. Just the hum of servers and the occasional buzz of motion-activated lights flickering on in hallways. No one was walking through. I sat in my chair and reviewed my folder again. It was solid, enough to show a consistent pattern of exclusion, enough to raise questions, but not enough to act alone. So I did what I had always done when I needed clarity. I went back to the data. I started cross-referencing internal promotion timelines. Who had moved up? When? What their evaluations looked like? How long they'd been in each role? I wasn't looking to accuse anyone. I was looking for structure. I needed to understand how the machine worked, because if I could see the system, I could show where it failed. What I found wasn't shocking, but it was sobering. Every individual promoted to leadership in the past 6 years had shared certain traits. Their work varied in quality, but their appearance, their backgrounds, their personalities, they aligned. Smooth, sociable, confident in a way that didn't challenge. Most of them had mentors. Most had early visibility. And none of them had skin like mine. I closed my laptop around 11:30 p.m. and sat in the dark for a while. My reflection stared back at me from the black screen. Same face, same scars, but not the same man from the week before. I no longer believed this was just bad luck or timing. It wasn't just me being forgettable. It was something baked into the fabric of the place. And now that I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I shut off the lights, locked up behind me, and stepped out into the cold. The air bit at my skin, sharp and honest. I pulled my coat tighter around me, but didn't rush. There was something calming about walking through the city after midnight, when everyone else was sleeping and pretending the world made sense. I knew it didn't, but I was done pretending. This wasn't just a missed opportunity, it was a pattern. A quiet mechanism of exclusion that had been working exactly as designed. And I'd finally started asking the right questions. I didn't tell anyone, not my co-workers, not the one friend I had in HR, not even my sister, who'd always been my sounding board through tougher times. There was something about this moment that required silence, a sharp, deliberate kind of solitude. I wasn't preparing for revenge. I wasn't fueled by drama or the need to make a scene. What I was building needed to be precise, unemotional, and quiet, like the way discrimination usually arrives. Every morning that week, I walked into the office like nothing had changed. I nodded to the receptionist, poured the same burnt coffee, sat at the same desk. I smiled when I had to, answered questions when they came. My inbox stayed full, my tasks delivered ahead of time. To the outside world, I was the same dependable Mark Reyes. But inside, something had calcified. A quiet clarity had taken hold. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger is too easy to dismiss. What I felt now was intention. I kept building the folder. Every lunch break, every late evening, I added to it. I traced decisions made in meetings I hadn't been invited to. I charted performance scores, mine against those of peers who had been fast-tracked. I copied down praise I'd received only in private messages, never publicly acknowledged. There were patterns in everything. How my name disappeared from group credits, how leadership used words like steady and reliable, but never innovative or visionary. I knew those were more than semantics. In this world, words like that open doors. I had been kept at the door for years. I didn't ask for advice because I already knew what most people would say. They'd tell me to be careful, to not rock the boat. That proving bias, especially based on something as abstract as appearance, was a losing game. But they didn't understand the difference between fighting to win and fighting to be seen. I wasn't expecting a courtroom drama. I wasn't looking to burn it all down. I just wanted the record to reflect the truth, for once. I started researching employment law. At night after work, I read through case studies, legal articles, even court filings. I focused on appearance-based bias, on the gray areas companies like to hide behind: cultural fit, executive image, client comfort. I learned that most cases like mine didn't go to trial. They settled, quietly, often with confidentiality clauses. The process wasn't about drama, it was about leverage, the kind you only get when you collect facts while everyone else assumes you're harmless. By the end of that second week, I had a timeline that stretched back 4 years. Promotions passed over, praise downplayed, work credited elsewhere, interview, evaluations that contradicted my performance metrics. But it was still circumstantial, so I started paying closer attention to language, the kind that slips out when people get too comfortable. Offhand comments, jokes. I remembered a quarterly meeting a year ago when a senior manager during a private conversation had referred to me as a backroom type. It sounded like a compliment at the time. Now I knew it wasn't. I searched my email archive and found it. A brief 3-line message summarizing a client debrief. My name mentioned once, followed by "Mark's great at staying behind the scenes." I highlighted it, saved it. Another piece for the folder. In the silence of working alone, I started to notice how much noise I had been ignoring for years. Not just the whispers or looks, but the institutional tone, the architecture of exclusion. Who was invited into rooms early? Who got the benefit of the doubt? Who got to make mistakes and still rise? I had avoided thinking about it for so long, because facing it meant acknowledging something harder than unfairness. It meant accepting that the game had never been neutral. I made contact with a legal organization that specialized in workplace discrimination. Not a firm with loud ads or promises of big payouts. Just a quiet nonprofit with a clean, factual website and a submission form. I wrote everything down, not emotionally, just the facts, bullet points, timelines, supporting documents. I attached the folder. I hit send at 2:41 a.m. 3 days later, I received a response, measured, professional. They said the case was potentially viable but difficult. That executive image was a legally gray area unless connected directly to protected characteristics. They asked for more evidence, anything verbal, any language from internal policies, any additional witnesses. I had no witnesses. People saw what they wanted to see. No one was going to risk their job to confirm what they never had the courage to name aloud. I understood that. I didn't resent it. Silence protects comfort, and most people choose comfort over justice every time. So I kept going alone. I pulled up a copy of the company's internal leadership criteria, tucked away in the onboarding handbook. Vague language wrapped in corporate polish. Traits like approachable polish and executive presence, public-facing potential. None of it quantifiable. All of it usable against someone who didn't match a preferred aesthetic. I screenshotted every line. Added commentary. Cross-referenced it with feedback I'd received over the years. I started crafting a narrative. Not a dramatic one, but a legal one. Quiet, sharp, factual. I listed every instance of my contributions being minimized. I outlined the leadership criteria and how it had been applied inconsistently. I wrote as if I were building a system, not for sympathy, but for clarity. The hardest part wasn't the work. It was staying quiet in the face of daily condescension. The way people now treated me as if I'd simply missed a shot I wasn't ready for. Their casual pity. Their quiet smirks when Daniel's name came up. He'd started leading team meetings with the same recycled language I had written into our strategy decks months before. No one said anything. No one remembered where the words came from. But I remembered. And now, everything I remembered had a place to go. Not into confrontation. Not into a hallway argument or a public call-out. Into the system I was building. Alone. One that would speak for me in a way I never could inside those rooms. One they wouldn't be able to ignore forever. The first time I heard my own story read back to me by someone else, it felt strange, almost clinical. The lawyer from the nonprofit, a quiet man named Patel, didn't dramatize anything. He didn't add emotion. He simply walked through the evidence I had submitted like he was reading the operating instructions to a broken machine. He pointed out what was useful, what needed clarification, and what, legally, would hold weight. I appreciated his tone. It matched the way I had built the case. No exaggeration, no anger, just a clear path through the quiet erosion of 8 years. We spoke over video. I kept my camera off, not out of shame, but because I didn't want to invite distraction into a conversation that needed to stay focused. I had learned the hard way how people responded to my face. Even in the most progressive rooms, the scars did something to their gaze, something I could never control. So I stayed a voice, a name, and a file full of facts. And in that form, I felt safer. Patel explained that cases like mine didn't usually explode in courtrooms. They moved quietly, like smoke through the gaps in a building. Sometimes they reached internal resolution. Sometimes they triggered a private settlement. But more often, they simply exposed the pressure points of a system built on plausible deniability. That was the term he used. Plausible deniability. The power of saying nothing outright, of letting the structure itself carry out the exclusion, while every individual piece claims innocence. It was a tactic as old as any system built to keep certain people out without ever writing it down. We worked together to refine the file. He asked for clearer timelines, better documentation of comparisons, specifically between myself and the people who had moved ahead. I expanded the spreadsheet, added dates, job titles, copies of project, files. I even found 2 performance summaries where my work was directly referenced as foundational to projects that others had later received full credit for. I annotated everything, highlighting the slow pattern of omission that couldn't be accidental anymore. One evening, after another round of revisions, Patel asked if I'd be willing to submit a formal complaint to the company's internal ethics board. It was a necessary step before any legal notice. I said yes, not because I believed they would do the right thing, but because I knew the silence would become part of the record. And that mattered more now than ever. Writing the complaint was harder than I expected. Not technically, it was just a document, but emotionally. It required putting into words the accumulation of subtle injuries that had never been acknowledged. I wrote it late one night, sitting at my kitchen table, the only light coming from the screen. I used no adjectives, no emotional appeals, just facts, the metrics, the disparities, the missed acknowledgments. I included my theory of appearance-based bias, supported by their own language in the leadership development materials, and listed examples of inconsistently applied standards. Submitted it just after midnight. I didn't expect a response quickly, but I didn't expect what I got either. 2 days passed. No acknowledgement. On the 3rd day, I received an email, not from HR, but from my direct supervisor, inviting me to touch base. It was vague, as these things usually are. I accepted the invite. The meeting was short. She thanked me for my contributions, said there had been a lot of shifts in organizational focus, and encouraged me to stay engaged. But she never mentioned the complaint. Not once. The message was clear. They knew. They had seen it. And they were choosing not to respond, at least not directly. That non-response was exactly what I needed. Patel told me we had enough. We began drafting the formal notice, an external complaint that would go beyond the company and into the legal system. I signed the documents in silence, not because I was afraid, but because the weight of it all didn't need words. It had been building for years, carried in every overlooked moment, every closed door, every glance that lasted 1 second too long. After we filed, there was quiet. Weeks of it. At work, no one said anything. I kept doing my job, submitting reports, attending meetings, sitting in the back of the room while Daniel led with words I once wrote. But the silence this time wasn't emptiness. It was tension. Controlled, rehearsed tension. I could see it in how people addressed me. Slight stiffness. A layer of politeness, too practiced to be sincere. Someone had spoken to them, maybe legal, maybe PR. I didn't care. The shift was enough to confirm what I already knew. Eventually, the company's legal team reached out, not to admit fault, just to begin the discussion. That's what they called it, a discussion. Patel handled it. I was copied on the emails, each one as dry and careful as the next. Language that bled responsibility from every sentence. No apologies. No direct responses to the substance of the complaint. Just offers to review the situation and consider mutually beneficial resolutions. We knew what that meant. Settlements like this weren't about money. Not to me. They were about the record. About making them put something in writing that acknowledged the system they'd helped protect. We pushed for a public statement, not naming me but naming the problem. That was the part they resisted most. But pressure works slowly. Facts tighten like a vice. And companies that trade in public image don't like unresolved questions hanging in the air. When the first draft of their proposed statement came through, it was vague. Committed to inclusion. Continuous improvement. Meaningless. Phrases. Patel rejected it, sent back our version, specific, honest, not accusing individuals, but naming the structural failure. Appearance bias, inconsistent standards, lack of transparent criteria in promotion. Another week passed, then another. And then they agreed. They issued the statement during a quarterly town hall. No names, no reference to any individual case. But there it was, in the mouth of an executive I'd never met, acknowledging that the company had fallen short in recognizing how non-performance-related biases may influence leadership selection. A commitment to revisiting criteria, a promise of third-party review. I watched it on the office live stream, alone, sitting in the same chair I'd sat in for 8 years. I didn't smile. I didn't feel vindicated. But I felt still. Not everything had changed. I wasn't promoted. No one clapped. No new opportunities opened the next day. But the silence had been broken. And the system even slightly had shifted. That was enough, for now. After the announcement, nothing happened right away. There were no handshakes, no hallway nods, no quiet acknowledgments from colleagues. The world inside the office kept spinning exactly as it had before. Emails, meetings, performance reviews, birthday cards signed by the whole floor. But something subtle had shifted beneath the surface, like a floorboard that doesn't creak until you know to listen for it. It was in the pauses, the way people spoke around certain topics, the way their eyes didn't linger quite as long on my face. The recognition wasn't spoken, but it was there. And strangely, that silence this time didn't feel like dismissal. It felt like distance from something that had finally broken. Weeks passed. I kept doing my job. Not out of loyalty, not out of some noble belief in corporate redemption. Just because that's who I am. I finish what I start, I show up. Even when the room never quite opens up for me. There's a kind of pride in that. A quiet discipline that doesn't need applause to feel real. But I was different now. Not in my work, not in my output, but in the way I moved through the building. I didn't shrink anymore. I didn't avoid reflective surfaces. I didn't measure my value by how easily others smiled at me. Eventually, HR called me in. A formal sit-down. The room was as neutral as always. Gray walls, fake plants, a table too small to be comfortable. They spoke in practiced tones, careful and professional. They wanted to thank me for bringing attention to an important issue. They acknowledged that leadership pathways had not always been communicated transparently. They reiterated that a third-party consultant would be conducting a review. The words were heavy with legal caution, but underneath them, I heard what mattered. They were documenting it. They were putting it into the system. And systems, once updated, don't forget, they offered a compensation package. Quiet, generous, with strings attached, of course. A mutual agreement. No fault admitted. Standard protocol. I reviewed it, had it vetted, and I signed it. Not because I wanted their money, but because it meant the final seal on everything I had built. It meant the end of pretending. It meant the story existed now beyond me. The next day I cleaned out my desk. 8 years condensed into one cardboard box, 2 notebooks, a cracked mug, a few certificates I'd stopped hanging on the wall. No one made a scene, no goodbyes that meant much. But as I walked out, I passed by the glass wall of the conference room where Daniel was presenting again. He caught sight of me just as I passed. We held eye contact for a second, then both looked away. I didn't hate him. He was a product of the same system. He played the part they wrote for him. The real story wasn't about him, and it never had been. Outside, the air was colder than I expected. It cut through my coat, made my eyes sting a little. I stood there for a moment on the sidewalk, watching people move past me, fast and indifferent. I looked at my reflection in the glass of the building, scars and all. I used to hate that view. I used to flinch. Now, I just looked. There was no triumph in my expression, no arrogance, just stillness, the kind that comes after a long storm, when the ground is still wet but the sky has cleared. In the weeks that followed, I received 2 messages that stayed with me. One from a former colleague who wrote simply, "Thank you. I saw more than I ever said." Another, anonymously sent, just said, "Your file helped me ask for a review. I think it made a difference." I didn't respond to either, not because I didn't care, but because I knew the point had never been recognition. It had been the record, the protocol, making sure the story didn't stay buried inside me, dismissed as paranoia or bitterness. There's a kind of freedom in knowing you named it, in knowing you didn't walk away quietly like they expected. I didn't get the promotion. I didn't become the face of the company, but I became something else, something they didn't see coming, a precedent, a marker in the system. The name, attached to the change they'll pretend they thought of themselves, and that's enough. Because some victories don't need applause. They just need to be written down.